To understand the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, you have to go back to some of its history. Vietnam had been under the control of the French. This was a result of French colonization over a very valuable plant that they had there, the rubber tree. After World War II, the Vietnamese began fighting for their independence under a group called the Viet Minh. The leader of this group was Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was the communist leader of Vietnam. That word communist should stand out to you. And hopefully you remember that after World War II, the United States, our foreign policy was containment, or stopping the spread of communism. Falling under containment was the operating theory of the domino theory. Just like a set of dominoes, if you stand them up, once one falls, they would all fall. That was the concern we had in regards to allowing countries to become communist. We were afraid that if we allowed one nation to become communist, that others would very soon follow. We sent advisors, and we also supported a government under a man by the name of Diem. He was a very corrupt man. He rigged elections, but like many others that you will see, because he was anti-communist, the United States supported him. He was also a very brutal man. He and his wife were Catholic in a country that was full of Buddhists. They were very brutal to these Buddhists and persecuted them on a regular basis. It was at this point, under Diem's control, that the Viet Cong began to fight. The Viet Cong, often called the VC and sometimes nicknamed Charlie by U.S. soldiers, these were South Vietnamese people who supported the North. You can see in this map that North Vietnam was controlled by communists. South Vietnam was not. It was under the control of Diem. We wanted to make sure that South Vietnam did not fall to North Vietnam communism. It was the Viet Cong, again, who were people who lived in South Vietnamese, who lived in South Vietnam, who supported the North and wanted to become communist. Diem's government was very unpopular, and eventually he is assassinated. At this point, we had already begun bombing by assisting French forces to try to regain control of the country. We are going to send a ship to the Gulf of Tonkin to observe. While that ship was there, it was attacked. This gives Lyndon B. Johnson a reason to go to Congress and ask for action or war. What he asked for becomes known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. President Johnson asked Congress for the power to send troops to Vietnam, to put men on the ground in Vietnam, without actually declaring war. So technically, the United States never actually declared war in Vietnam. But at one point in time during this war, we had 500,000 troops on the ground. What becomes very interesting is that this statement and asking for that resolution was actually prepared before the attack, which raises a really interesting question of why was our ship there, and was this a pre-planned action, which is something that you'll look at in some documents from that time period. In what is called Operation Rolling Thunder, there had already begun limited bombing of North Vietnam. This is a very different war. Our war leaders, who were Secretary of State Robert McNamara and General William Westmoreland, are both going to be responsible for escalating American involvement during this time. The Viet Cong were a very difficult enemy to fight. They used guerrilla tactics, meaning they knew the countryside. This was their country. So they would simply not come out and fight unless they had the upper hand. If they didn't have the upper hand, they would just disappear and go into a system of underground tunnels or into the jungles. This made it very difficult to fight this enemy. It also was very difficult to determine who our friends were and who our enemies were. Remember, I told you, the United States was there to support South Vietnam. Yet I also told you that the Viet Cong were South Vietnamese people who were fighting for the North. And these soldiers were not your typical soldiers. The Viet Cong did not wear NVA or North Vietnamese regular army uniforms. They simply lived their lives and then undercover would fight the Americans. This is going to cause the United States to use search and destroy tactics, basically to move from place to place, looking for the enemy and engaging when they found him. It becomes a war of attrition on both sides. Attrition means we're trying to wear them down. But in reality, both sides were fighting this way, trying to wait the other one out, hoping the other would get tired, give up, and go home. We used two very unique weapons in this war. The first was napalm. Napalm is a flame bomb. It's like jellied gasoline. And if you know what the jelly is like that you put on your toast at breakfast in the morning, imagine a gasoline made of that texture. So you know when the bomb hits, it sticks to everything, and then when it ignites, it is going to cause a major fire. The next was Agent Orange. Agent Orange is a defoliant. It's going to kill the leaves on the trees of these massive jungles. It was hoping that we would be able to spot our enemy much easier. Unfortunately, this particular chemical was very harmful to people. It was called Agent Orange because it turned the leaves on the trees, a burnt orange color. You see that here on the bottom right picture, a plane spraying Agent Orange. Unfortunately, yes, this was harmful to people, and it's unfortunate that it was harmful to the Vietnamese. However, it was also harmful to our own troops and was found that it caused a lot of damage, a lot of health problems, not only to these soldiers, but to children that they had, and caused problems for many years to come. Our soldiers had a very low morale. They were questioning why we were fighting in this particular war, that many argued was simply a civil war between the North and South Vietnamese. On top of the question about why we were fighting, the Great Society, which had actually been helping Americans, helping many poor Americans, the money that was used to fund these programs is going to be cut in order to pay for the war effort. So many of those Great Society programs had to be cut and went away. The fact that this is the first television war, the fact that there were news cameras on the ground in Vietnam is also going to change the way Americans viewed this war. Americans are watching this war in their living rooms every night. This is very different from simply hearing this on the radio as they had in previous wars. You had reporters on the ground showing exactly what was happening. And remember, too, this is a draft war, meaning that there were many Americans who were drafted into this war. So many Americans had family or friends who were directly on the ground in Vietnam. Also, because of this very heavy media presence, we're going to see a credibility gap develop. You see here is the news anchor Walter Cronkite in the bottom picture. He is going to be one of the major news anchors that delivers the news to the American people every night. What we begin to see is that the reporters were telling a different story from what the president was reporting. So we see this gap develop, this credibility gap between what Johnson was reporting and what the people on the ground were reporting. It made it very difficult to trust President Johnson. Protests are going to begin. This nightly news coverage, seeing the very real horror of war, is going to make it much more difficult for Americans to support this war. Those who did support the war effort, you had hawks who were for the war and doves who were against the war. Unfortunately, this is a war where there was no real end in sight. There was no clear enemy. It was hard to pin the enemy down, and it was also hard to put a particular end point on when the fighting would actually cease. So this makes it a very hard war to fight. Again, many of these soldiers and many Americans questioned why we were fighting this war to begin with. As you're going to see in just a second, many people called this a working man's war. We're going to look at some very unfair draft practices that, because of the way the draft was run, it is going to unfairly target poor Americans. So those poor Americans are going to be actually drafted and then actually wind up fighting in this war than other Americans. This was very unfair and is going to lead to many, many protests. Some of these unfair protests, which is why many people protested, these unfair draft practices, which is why many people protested, one in particular was called a deferment. A deferment is a delay in military service. One way to get a deferment was to be a college student. As long as you were a college student in good standing, your draft status was bumped up. Even if you were drafted, it would be basically put on hold. Again, going back to that idea of this being a working man's war, remember, if you could afford to go to college, you were not one of these poorer Americans. So your poorer Americans who could not afford to go to college would not receive these deferments. You could also get a status called a CO status or conscientious objector status. This is where you would have to argue and convince a panel that for either religious or moral reasons you do not believe in war. This is a pretty difficult thing to prove. However, if you knew somebody on your local draft board, it was a lot easier to get this conscientious objector status. And as you can already guess, if you know somebody on the draft board, you're probably not a poor American. Many others, once they were drafted, rather than actually serve in the military, many Americans dodged the draft or were called draft dodgers by simply leaving the country. Later, we will see what happens to them once the actual war is over. Again, they felt this was an unfair practice. And not only did it affect your lower classes of Americans, it affected African Americans as well, mostly related to their socioeconomic status. So you see that these very unfair practices are going to lead many Americans to question why we were fighting in this war, why we were involved in Vietnam to begin with. As the war drags on, they will continue to ask these questions and many more difficult questions that we will be looking at later.